The air at the Henderson estate auction hung thick and heavy, a mixture of late October dust, cheap cigar smoke, and the bittersweet smell of another man's life being sold off piece by piece. Silas Blackwood stood near the back, his arms crossed over his canvas work coat, the fabric worn smooth and thin at the elbows. He wasn't here for the land. Old man Henderson had leveraged himself into a corner, and the bank was taking the farm. Silas was here for the iron. Specifically, a tired-looking New Holland 68 baler that was missing a pickup tooth and had more rust than paint. He'd seen it on the preview day, kicked the tires, and run a calloused thumb over the plunger arm. It was sound where it counted. A murmur went through the crowd as the auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Earl, moved from the household goods to the machinery line. The centerpiece, gleaming under the weak autumn sun, was a nearly new International Harvester 856 with wide rubber and a factory cab. It was Henderson's last desperate purchase, a monument to bad timing. "All right, folks, here she is," Earl bellowed, his voice crackling through a portable speaker. "The pride of the fleet, barely 500 hours on the tach. Who'll start the bidding at $10,000? Silas didn't even glance at it. His eyes were fixed on the smaller, older pieces, huddled together like forgotten orphans at the end of the line. A rusty John Deere grain drill, a Massey Ferguson 35 utility tractor, and his baler. That was his territory, the land of paid-for steel and simple mechanics. A hand clapped him hard on the shoulder, nearly knocking the breath out of him. Daydreaming about the good old days, Silas? Thinking you could plough the North 80 with that old Massey? Silas turned slowly. It was Ray Miller. Younger than Silas by a good 15 years, Ray farmed with the bank's money and an unshakable confidence that bordered on arrogance. He was dressed in clean overalls and a brand-new seed corn cap, his face flushed with the thrill of the auction. "Just watching, Ray," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. "Watching the world pass you by," Ray chuckled, gesturing with his chin toward the gleaming red IH tractor. "Now that's a machine. That's how you get ahead in this business. Got to spend money to make money, old man." Silas's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. He'd heard it all before. At the co-op, at the diner, over the fence line. Silas Blackwood, the man who still ran a John Deere 60 and a Farmall Super M his father had bought new. The man who thought $1 in the bank was better than $1 of debt. He was a relic, a stubborn fool clinging to the past, while men like Ray Miller were building empires on credit. The bidding on the 856 was fierce. Ray jumped in at 12,000, his voice loud and clear, making sure everyone knew he was a player. He was bidding against a couple of other younger farmers, all of them flush with the promise of good crop prices and easy credit from the Production Credit Association. The price climbed, fast and furious, finally settling on Ray's final bid of $14,200. A wave of applause rippled through the crowd as Ray signed the clerk's slip, a wide, triumphant grin plastered on his face. He swaggered back over to Silas, waving the paper. "See that? That's progress. Bet you haven't spent that much on equipment in your whole life." "You're right, I haven't," Silas said quietly. "But every piece I own outright." Ray just laughed, a short, sharp bark. "And what's it gotten you? 160 acres of sweat and rust. I'll be farming 1,000 acres by the time I'm 40. You watch." He clapped Silas on the shoulder again. "Good luck with your antiques." He strode off toward his new prize, the crowd parting for him like he was royalty. Silas watched him go, a familiar ache settling in his chest. It wasn't envy. It was something closer to pity, but he couldn't have explained why. He just knew, deep in his bones, that steel and soil and sky had rules, and the bank didn't always respect them. The auctioneer moved on, selling off the bigger implements that had gone with the IH. A 6-bottom plough, a 20-foot disc. They all went for high prices. Finally, Earl and his crew worked their way down to the forgotten end of the line. "What have we got here?" Earl said, feigning confusion as he looked at the old New Holland baler. "Looks like a real classic. She ain't pretty, folks, but I bet she's got some life in her. Who'll give me $100 to start it?" Silence. A few farmers chuckled. $50, Earl pleaded. "Come on, it's worth that in scrap." "25, Silas said, his voice calm but clear. It cut through the murmuring. Earl's head snapped up, a grin spreading across his face. "There's a man who knows a bargain. I got 25, who'll give me 30. 30! Going once?" No one else moved. Ray Miller, standing by his new tractor, shook his head in theatrical disbelief. "Sold!" Earl shouted, pointing his gavel at Silas. "For $25 to the man who still believes in elbow grease." Silas walked forward, pulled a worn leather wallet from his back pocket, and counted out 2 10s and a 5 in crisp, clean bills. He didn't need a loan. He didn't need a payment plan. He paid his way. As the clerk wrote him a receipt, he could hear Ray's voice carrying across the yard. $25. He'll put 100 hours of work into it, and it'll still be a piece of junk. Some people never learn. The laughter that followed stung more than the cold autumn wind. Silas ignored it. He hooked the baler to the back of his old Ford F-250, the one with the straight-six engine and the 4-speed on the floor. He checked the hitch pin, kicked the tires one last time, and climbed into the cab. As he drove away, the last thing he saw in his rearview mirror was Ray Miller, sitting high in the cab of his new International, king of a kingdom built on borrowed time. Before we go any further into this story, I have to ask you something. Take a moment and think about it. Have you, or someone in your family, a father, a grandfather, an uncle, ever had a piece of machinery like that? Something old, something paid for, something everyone else called junk? A tractor, a truck, a tool that wasn't the newest or the fastest, but it was yours, and it never let you down. Drop a comment below and tell me about that old iron. I want to hear about the machines that built this country, one dusty field at a time. The drive home was slow. The old baler rattled and swayed behind the truck, its rusty metal groaning with every bump in the road. Silas didn't mind. He was already taking it apart in his head, making a list. A new pickup tooth, he could forge that himself. The plunger bearings felt a little loose. He'd have to check the tolerances. New belts for the flywheel. A good pressure washing to knock the years of caked-on grime off. A gallon of New Holland red paint, maybe, if he was feeling generous. His farm wasn't much to look at from the road, not compared to the sprawling manicured operations that were starting to pop up around the county. His barn was old. The red paint faded to a dull, sun-bleached rose. The house was a simple 2-story clapboard, the same one his grandfather had built. But the fence rows were clean, the fields were contoured to prevent erosion, and the shop was Silas's sanctuary. He backed the baler next to the wide double doors and unhitched it. The sun was getting low, casting long shadows across the yard. Inside the shop, the air was cool and smelled of motor oil, welding flux, and damp earth. It was a cathedral of self-reliance. Along one wall stood a heavy-duty drill press he'd bought at another auction. A Lincoln arc welder sat in the corner, its cables coiled neatly. And on the benches, rows of wrenches, sockets and calipers lay in perfect order, each tool clean and in its proper place. This was where Silas fought his battles, not with bankers or salesmen, but with stripped threads, seized bearings, and cracked castings. For the next 2 weeks, Silas spent every spare moment on the baler. He'd do his chores before sunup, feeding the handful of cattle he kept and checking the fences, Then, after a quick breakfast, he'd head to the shop. He pulled the knotter assembly first, the heart of any square baler. It was a complex, beautiful piece of machinery, a clockwork of gears and bills and knives that had to operate in perfect synchronicity. He took it apart, piece by piece on his workbench, laying each part on a clean rag in the order it was removed. He used a can of kerosene and a stiff brush to clean away decades of grease and packed chaff, revealing the bare, honest metal beneath. He found the problem. The billhook pin was worn, causing it to occasionally miss a knot, a $10 part if you could find it. He drove the 30 miles to the New Holland dealer in the county seat. The parts man, a young kid with slicked back hair, laughed when Silas showed him the old pin. "Haven't seen one of these in years," the kid said, wiping his hands on a rag. "We don't carry parts for a Model 68 anymore. You'd be better off just buying a new baler. We've got some nice 273s on the lot. Easy financing." "I don't want a new baler," Silas said, his patience wearing thin. "I want a billhook pin. Part number 605 or 32. The kid shrugged and went to look through a dusty collection of old catalogues in the back room. He came back 20 minutes later, blowing dust off a thick, paper-bound book. "You're in luck, old-timer. Says here there's one left in the regional warehouse in Des Moines. Take 3 days to get here. $10.54. Silas paid in cash and left. 3 days. That was fine. It gave him time to work on the rest of it. He took the big flywheel off and used a wire wheel on his bench grinder to clean every speck of rust from the V-grooves. He replaced the belts. He inspected the plunger, sharpening the knife and checking the clearance. He found a hairline crack in one of the pickup arms and spent an afternoon carefully grinding it out, preheating the cast iron with a torch, and laying a bead of high nickel welding rod into the groove. He built it up slowly, peening the weld with a small hammer between passes to relieve the stress, just like his father had taught him. It wasn't a pretty weld, but it was strong, stronger than new. While he worked, he could hear the sound of Ray Miller's new 856 echoing across the valley. The big International diesel had a deep, throaty roar that carried for miles, a constant reminder of the new way of farming. Ray was fall plowing, turning over hundreds of acres with his 6-bottom plow, working day and night. Silas was still using his old John Deere 60, the one with the 2-cylinder engine that went pop, pop, pop. It pulled a 3-bottom plow. It was slow, steady work. He'd get his plowing done, just like he always did. It would just take him longer. One afternoon, the county extension agent, a fresh-faced college kid named David, stopped by. He saw Silas wrestling with the baler's gearbox and shook his head. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, leaning against the doorframe of the shop. "You know, university studies show that a farmer's time is his most valuable asset. The hours you're spending on this old machine, you could be using that time to plan your crop rotation, study the markets, or even take on some custom work with a more modern piece of equipment." Silas wiped his greasy hands on a red rag and looked the young man in the eye. "Son, there are 2 kinds of costs in this world. The kind you pay with money and the kind you pay with sweat. I find I'm usually shorter on the first kind." David didn't seem to understand. He launched into a speech about depreciation schedules, efficiency gains, and the benefits of leveraging assets. Silas just nodded politely, letting the words wash over him. He'd heard it all before. It was the gospel of the new age, and he was a heretic. When David finally left, Silas went back to work, the solid, reassuring weight of a wrench in his hand, feeling more real than all the fancy words and university studies in the world. The pin arrived on a Friday. Silas drove to town to get it, and by Saturday afternoon, The knotter was reassembled, cleaned, oiled, and timed to perfection. He put the last guard back on the PTO shaft, stood back, and admired his work. The baler still looked old. The paint was faded, and the metal was pitted in places. But it was whole. It was ready. He'd spent a total of $48 on parts and a gallon of gear oil, and he knew every nut, bolt, and cotter pin on that machine. When it broke down in the middle of a hayfield, and it would, they all did, he wouldn't have to call a dealer and wait for a $200 an hour mechanic. He would fix it himself, right there in the field, with the tools he carried in his truck. That evening, as the sun set, he sat on the porch, cleaning grease from under his fingernails with a pocket knife. He could still hear Ray's tractor, its headlights now cutting swaths through the darkness on the far ridge. The sound was different now, strained. Silas listened closely, his farmer's ear attuned to the language of machinery. The engine was missing, a slight but unmistakable stumble in its rhythm. Ray was pushing it too hard. A new machine, still under warranty, but a machine nonetheless. And all machines, new or old, had their breaking point. Silas didn't smile. He felt no satisfaction. He just took a deep breath of the cool night air and went inside for supper. The race was long, and he planned on finishing it. The next few years rolled by in a cycle of seasons, each one blurring into the last. The early 1970s arrived, and with them, a change in the wind. The talk in town shifted. Whispers of a massive grain sale to the Soviet Union turned into front-page news. Commodity prices, which had been stagnant for years, began to climb. First corn, then soybeans, then wheat. It was like a fever gripping the heartland. Land prices, which had been slowly inching up, suddenly exploded. A farm that had sold for $500 an acre was now fetching $1,000, then $1,500. The bankers, once cautious and conservative, were now smiling, handing out money like it was going out of style. For men like Ray Miller, it was a golden age. He was perfectly positioned to take advantage of it. His big new equipment allowed him to farm more acres, faster. With the price of corn doubling, he paid off the 856 in a single year. But he didn't stop there. He used his newfound equity as a down payment on the 200 acres bordering his farm to the south. Then he went back to the bank and financed an even bigger tractor, an International Harvester 1466 with duals and a turbocharged engine that screamed like a jet. He bought a new 6-row corn planter and a gleaner combine with a floating grain head. Ray's operation became the model of success for the entire county. His fields were showcases, long, straight rows planted with military precision. His grain bins, brand new and silver, gleamed in the sun. He was featured in the State Farming magazine, standing in front of his new equipment, his arm around his smiling wife, the very picture of the modern American farmer. The laughter directed at Silas Blackwood didn't stop. It just changed its tone. It was no longer scornful, but laced with a kind of pity. At the co-op, other farmers would shake their heads as Silas loaded a few bags of seed into the back of his old Ford. "Silas, you're sitting on a gold mine, and you're still trying to chip away at it with a pickaxe," one of them told him, gesturing at the soaring price charts on the wall. "You could double your acreage, triple it. The bank would give you anything you want right now." Silas would just nod. The bank gives, and the bank takes away. His own finances had improved, of course. The higher prices meant he had more money in his pocket at the end of the year. But his philosophy didn't change. He saw the boom for what it was, a temporary swing in the great, unpredictable cycle of farming. Instead of buying more land at inflated prices, he paid off the last few $1,000s he owed on his original mortgage. The day he got the deed, free and clear. He didn't celebrate. He just put the paper in his safe deposit box at the bank, feeling a quiet, profound sense of relief. It was his, all of it. The house, the barn, the 160 acres of black Iowa soil. No one could take it from him. He did allow himself one upgrade. He'd always had his eye on the John Deere 4020. To his mind, it was one of the finest tractors ever built, powerful enough for heavy tillage, nimble enough for cultivating, and reliable as the sunrise. The new ones were far too expensive, but he found a used one from the late 60s, a side console model with a diesel engine. It had 5,000 hours on it. The paint was faded, and the seat was torn, but the engine was strong, and the transmission was tight. He drove a hard bargain and bought it for $6,000. He paid cash. The day he drove it home, Ray Miller happened to be passing by in his brand-new pickup truck. He pulled over, a smirk on his face. Well, look at that. Silas Blackwood finally joining the 20th century, Ray called out. A 4020, huh? Good little chore tractor. I was thinking of getting one to run the auger. Silas just grunted, his hands gripping the familiar steering wheel. The powerful 6-cylinder diesel hummed beneath him, a sound of solid, dependable power. It felt good. You know, Silas, Ray continued, leaning on the door of his truck, I just closed on the old Henderson place, the whole section. Gonna put it all in corn next year. Bought one of them new Steigers to pull the disc. A real 4-wheel drive monster. Makes that thing you're driving look like a garden tractor. Good for you, Ray, Silas said, easing the clutch out and putting the tractor in gear. Times are good, old man. You got to get in while the getting's good, Ray shouted after him. You're going to get left behind. Silas didn't look back. He drove his new tractor into his yard, the engine's steady rhythm a comfort. Left behind? Maybe. Or maybe he was just standing still on solid ground while everyone else was running full tilt toward the edge of a cliff they couldn't even see. He spent the winter in his shop, methodically going over the 4020. He did a full service, changing all the fluids and filters. He adjusted the valves, rebuilt the injectors, and replaced the worn-out hydraulic hoses. He didn't just want it to run, he wanted to know it, inside and out. He wanted to understand its language, its weaknesses, its strengths. By the spring of 1978, the fever was at its peak. Interest rates at the bank had started to creep up, from 7% to 9%, then to 11%. Nobody seemed to notice. The price of land was still climbing, and the price of corn was holding steady. But Silas felt a change. The air was different. There was a desperation underlying the optimism at the diner. The jokes were a little louder, the laughter a little too forced. The price of fuel had nearly tripled. Fertilizer costs were through the roof. The margins were getting thinner, even with high crop prices. To make the same amount of money, you had to farm more land, which meant borrowing more money to buy the land and the equipment to farm it. It was a vicious cycle, a treadmill set at an ever-increasing speed. One crisp autumn afternoon, Silas was finishing up his soybean harvest with his old John Deere 95 combine, another piece of equipment he'd bought used and rebuilt himself. He was working a small field that bordered Ray Miller's massive operation. Across the fence, Ray's brand-new Gleaner N7 was chewing through 1,000 acres of corn, a cloud of dust and chaff billowing behind it. It was an impressive sight, a machine of incredible scale and efficiency. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, the roar from across the fence suddenly died. The Gleaner coasted to a stop in the middle of a pass. Silas finished his own row, shut down his combine, and watched. He saw Ray get out of the cab, walk around the big machine, and kick one of the massive tires in frustration. After a few minutes, Ray's pickup truck came speeding down the field road. He and a hired hand spent an hour working on it, their figures silhouetted against the setting sun. But the combine remained silent. Later that evening, Silas was in his shop, sharpening the blades on his disc, when he heard a truck pull into the yard. It was Ray. He looked tired, his face smudged with grease, his usual arrogance replaced by a weary frustration. "Silas," he said, not meeting his eyes, "you still got that old welder?" "It's in the corner," Silas said, gesturing with his head. "The main hydraulic pump on my N7 went out," Ray explained, his voice flat. "Cracked the housing. The dealer can't get a new one here for 2 days, and there's rain in the forecast for the end of the week. I got 600 acres of corn still standing in the field." He finally looked at Silas. "I was hoping maybe you could take a look at it. See if you can patch it up enough to get me through." Silas wiped his hands on his rag and looked out the shop door into the darkness. He could hear the wind rustling the dry leaves in the trees, a lonely, whispering sound. He thought of the years of laughter, the pitying looks, the constant dismissals. He could have said no. He could have enjoyed the moment, the reversal of fortunes. But that wasn't his way. "Let's go take a look," Silas said, grabbing his welding helmet and a handful of high nickel rods. "Fire up your truck. I'll follow you." As they drove through the night, a single thought echoed in Silas's mind. The new machines were faster, bigger, more powerful. But when they broke hard. And you couldn't fix a cracked computer chip or a busted hydraulic servo with a wrench and a welder. You had to call the dealer. You had to wait for the part. You had to pay the bill. And all the while, your crop sat in the field, vulnerable to the wind and the rain and the relentless ticking of the clock, each tick another dollar of interest on the loans that had bought the magnificent, fragile machine in the first place. A storm was coming. He could feel it in his bones. And it wasn't just the rain in the forecast. The light from Ray's pickup truck cut a nervous, bouncing path across the stubble fields as Silas followed in his old Ford. The night was cold, with a sharp wind that promised a hard frost before morning. When they arrived, the Gleaner N7 stood like a wounded giant in the glare of the headlights, its massive grain head tilted at a sad angle. A pool of hydraulic fluid, black and slick, had stained the dry earth beneath it. Ray's hired hand, a young man named Billy, was shivering beside the machine, a useless wrench in his hand. "Couldn't even get the inspection plate off, Mr. Miller. Them bolts are on there tighter than a drum." Silas walked over, carrying a small steel toolbox and his welding leads. He didn't say a word. He laid a trouble light on the frame, its yellow glare illuminating the belly of the combine. The hydraulic pump was tucked deep inside the machine's guts, a maze of high-pressure lines and wiring harnesses surrounding it. It was a mechanic's nightmare, designed for assembly line efficiency, not field repair. "There's the problem," Silas said, pointing a greasy finger at a hairline crack running across the thick cast-iron housing of the pump. It was weeping a slow, steady trickle of oil. "You must have deadheaded a cylinder. Built up too much pressure." "The book says you have to pull the whole unit," Ray said, his voice tight with anxiety. "That's an 8-hour job, not counting the time to get the part." Silas just grunted. He took a long-handled ratchet and a socket from his box. He put his weight into it, his knuckles white, and with a sharp groan of protesting metal, the first bolt broke free. Then the next, and the next. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy of motion that Ray had never seen up close. It wasn't the frantic energy of a man racing a clock. It was the patient, methodical work of a man who understood the nature of steel. For the next 4 hours, under the cold, star-filled sky, Silas became a surgeon. He drained the remaining fluid, carefully disconnected the lines, and with Ray's help, wrestled the heavy pump out of its cradle. He laid it on the tailgate of his truck. "Can you fix it?" Ray asked, his voice barely a whisper. Silas ran a thumb over the crack. "Maybe. Can't weld it hot, it'll just crack again when it cools. Got to stitch it cold." He went to work with a grinder, carefully beveling the edges of the crack to create a V-groove. He cleaned it with a solvent until the metal shone. Then he fired up the portable welder in the back of Ray's truck, the engine settling into a loud, steady roar that shattered the night silence. He didn't use the high nickel rods he'd brought. Instead, he pulled out a special brazing rod, the kind designed for cast iron repair. He worked slowly, laying down short, 1-inch beads, then stopping to peen the weld with a small ball peen hammer, tapping it gently to relieve the stress in the metal. He'd weld a bead on one side of the crack, then move to the opposite side, stitching it together like a seamstress mending cloth. It was a painstaking process. Ray and Billy watched in silence, mesmerized. They were used to replacing parts, not resurrecting them. By the time the moon was high and the temperature had dropped to freezing, Silas was done. The weld wasn't pretty, a lumpy, bronze-colored scar on the black iron. But it was solid. He let it cool slowly, covering it with a heavy canvas tarp before they began the arduous task of reinstalling it. Just before dawn, they tightened the last bolt. Ray filled the reservoir with new hydraulic fluid, his hands shaking slightly from exhaustion and cold. He climbed into the cab, took a deep breath, and turned the key. The big diesel engine roared to life. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a hydraulic whine, the massive grain head slowly, smoothly lifted off the ground. Ray leaned out of the cab, his face a mixture of disbelief and profound relief. "It's holding, Silas. It's actually holding." "It'll get you through harvest," Silas said, packing his tools. "But you ought to order that new housing. That's a patch, not a permanent fix." Ray shut the machine down and climbed out. He walked over to Silas, pulling out his wallet. "What do I owe you?" Silas looked at the wallet, then at Ray's tired, grime-streaked face. He thought of the $25 he'd paid for his baler and the laughter that had followed. He shook his head. "You don't owe me anything, Ray. Just be careful. This ground is changing. You can feel it." Ray didn't understand, but he nodded, too exhausted to argue. "Thanks, Silas. I mean it." As Silas drove home, the first rays of sun were breaking over the horizon. He'd gotten Ray's magnificent machine running again, but his warning hung in the air. The patch would hold for a while, but the pressures building up in the world beyond their fence lines were far greater than anything a hydraulic pump could generate, and no amount of welding could fix what was about to break. The storm Silas had sensed arrived not as rain, but as numbers on a ledger. In Washington, a man named Paul Volcker, the new chairman of the Federal Reserve, declared war on inflation. He raised the prime interest rate, and then he raised it again. The number, once a stable, single digit, began a terrifying climb. 12%, 15, 18. By 1981, it peaked at a staggering 21.5%. For farmers like Silas, who owed nothing, it was an inconvenience. The cost of fuel and seed went up, but he could absorb it. For farmers like Ray Miller, leveraged to the hilt with variable rate loans, it was a death sentence. His operating loan for spring planting, which he'd budgeted at 9%, was suddenly 18%. The payments on his land and his new Steiger tractor doubled overnight. Then came the second blow. The bottom fell out of the grain market. An embargo on sales to the Soviet Union, coupled with a global recession, sent prices plummeting. Corn that had been selling for over $3 a bushel was now barely worth $2. Ray was caught in a perfect storm. Skyrocketing expenses and collapsing income. The change in the county was palpable. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by a quiet, gnawing fear. The talk at the diner was no longer about buying new land, but about how to hold on to what you had. One by one, the for sale signs began to appear, not the hopeful signs of farmers retiring rich, but the stark, desperate signs of bank foreclosures. The Henderson auction had been a single, isolated tragedy. This was a plague. Silas watched it all with a heavy heart. He saw families who had farmed the same ground for 100 years pack their belongings into U-Haul trucks. He saw brand new equipment, barely a year old, sitting idle in sheds because the owners couldn't afford the fuel to run it, let alone the payments. One Tuesday in the spring of 1982, another auction notice was posted at the co-op. This one hit like a punch to the gut. The assets of Miller Farms. The bank was calling the note. Everything was to be sold. The 1,000 acres, the gleaming bins, the house, and the machines. The entire empire, built on the promise of ever-rising prices and easy credit, was being liquidated. The day of the auction was grey and cold, a miserable mist hanging in the air. The crowd was different from the one at the Henderson sale. There was no festive atmosphere, no thrill of the bargain. It was a gathering of ghosts, farmers in worn coats and muddy boots, their faces etched with the grim recognition that it could just as easily be them. They were there to bear witness to a neighbor's demise. Silas stood at the back, just as he had before. Ray was there, standing beside his wife, looking like a stranger on his own farm. He was thin, his face hollowed out, the cocksure grin replaced by a vacant stare. He looked 10 years older. The auctioneer, the same fast-talking Earl, sounded subdued. He knew these people. He knew what this meant. He started with the machinery. The big Steiger four-wheel drive, Ray's monster, the one that had made Silas's 4020 look like a toy. It had cost Ray over $100,000 just 3 years earlier. The bidding was slow, agonizing. It finally sold for $30,000 to an out-of-state investment group. The Gleaner N7, the one Silas had patched together in the dead of night, went for a fraction of its value. No local farmer had the cash or the credit to buy it. One by one, Ray's symbols of progress were sold off for pennies on the dollar, the brutal arithmetic of deflation on full display. When the auctioneer got to the smaller tools, he held up a red metal toolbox, a nice craftsman set. Silas recognized it. He'd seen it in Ray's shop. "All right, what am I bid for this fine set of tools?" Earl asked. Silence. $10? $20, Silas said, his voice clear and steady. Heads turned. A few people nodded in quiet approval. "I got 20. Who'll give me 25? No one spoke. It was a gesture of respect. They were letting Silas have it. Sold for $20 to Silas Blackwood. After the sale was over, after the last piece of Ray Miller's life had been auctioned away, Silas walked over and handed Ray 2 crisp $10 bills. Ray just looked at the money in his hand, then up at Silas. His eyes were glistening. "Why, Silas?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "After everything. All the times I made fun of your old junk." "This isn't about the machines, Ray," Silas said, his voice gentle. "It was never about the machines." He handed Ray the toolbox. "You'll need these." Ray took it, his hand trembling. He opened the lid. Inside, every wrench and socket was clean, and in its place, a small island of order in a world of chaos. He finally broke, the tears he'd been holding back tracing clean paths through the grime on his cheeks. He wasn't a king anymore. He wasn't an empire builder. He was just a man who had lost his farm. And in that moment of total defeat, for the first time, another farmer was treating him not as a competitor, but as a neighbor. A week later, Silas saw another notice at the bank. The Miller home place, the original 80 acres with the house and the barns, hadn't sold at the auction. The bank owned it now, and they were desperate to get it off their books. They were asking a price so low it was almost insulting, a price that reflected the utter collapse of the land market. Silas went home and sat at his kitchen table for a long time, looking at his own account book. The numbers were modest, but they were all written in black ink. He had no debts. He had cash in the bank, saved from the good years. He thought about the laughter. He thought about the arrogance. Then he thought about Ray's face at the auction, the look of a man who had lost his entire world. The next morning, he went to the bank. He didn't haggle. He didn't ask for terms. He wrote a check for the full asking price and bought the Miller home place, free and clear. That evening, he drove his old Ford over to the small rental house in town where Ray and his family were staying. He found Ray sitting on the front steps, staring at nothing. "The bank sold the home place," Ray said without looking up, his voice dead. "Some corporate outfit from Des Moines, I suppose. Gonna bulldoze the grove and put in a hog confinement." "No," Silas said quietly. "I bought it." Ray's head snapped up, his face a mask of confusion and anger. "You? You bought it? After all this, you're gonna kick me when I'm down? You're gonna plow my fields with your rusty old junk and laugh all the way?" Silas sat down on the step next to him. The air was cool and smelled of rain. "No, Ray, I'm not going to farm it. You are." Ray stared at him, uncomprehending. "I'm not a landlord," Silas continued, looking out at the street, "but I can't farm 2 places by myself. I need a good tenant, someone who knows the ground. I'll rent it to you. A simple crop share lease. You provide the labor, I'll provide the land and the equipment. We'll use my machines. They're old, but they're paid for. We'll split the costs and split the crop, 50-50. It won't make you rich, but it'll keep your family in that house. It'll keep your hands in the soil." Ray was speechless. He opened his mouth, then closed it. The sheer, unexpected grace of the offer was too much to process. All his life, he had measured success in acres, horsepower, and bushels per acre. He had seen Silas as a failure, a relic from a bygone era. And now, that relic was offering him not just a job, but a chance at redemption. He was offering him a way to stay on the land his grandfather had homesteaded. "Why?" Ray finally managed to ask, his voice thick with emotion. Silas looked over at him, his weathered face serious in the fading light. "Because the bank owns enough of this county already. This land needs a farmer on it, not a corporation. And you're a good farmer, Ray. You just listened to the wrong people." He stood up, his joints creaking. "The house is empty. You can move back in tomorrow. I'll bring the 40-20 and the plow over in the morning. We've got a lot of work to do." He walked back to his truck, leaving Ray sitting on the steps, the weight of a second chance settling on his shoulders like the evening dew. The years that followed were lean, but they were good. The partnership was an unlikely one. The cautious, debt-averse traditionalist and the chastened, once arrogant modernist. They farmed together, Silas with his deep, intuitive knowledge of the soil and machinery, and Ray with his understanding of new seed hybrids and chemical applications. They made it work. They used Silas's old John Deere 60 for the light work and the 40-20 for the heavy tillage. They planted with the old grain drill Silas had bought at the Henderson sale, and in the summer they put up hay with the New Holland 68 baler, the $25 machine that had started it all. The talk in the diner changed. No one called Silas a fool anymore. He was spoken of with a quiet respect. He was the man who had survived, the man who had seen the storm coming when everyone else was looking at the sunshine. Younger farmers, The ones who had managed to hang on started stopping by his shop, not to talk about interest rates, but to ask how to set the timing on an old diesel or how to braise a piece of cast iron. He never preached. He just showed them, sharing the knowledge his father had passed down to him. Ray Miller changed, too. The arrogance was gone, burned away by the fires of failure. He learned to work with old iron, to listen to the language of the machines. He spent long hours in Silas's shop, learning to weld, to rebuild an engine, to make do. He discovered a satisfaction in it that he'd never found in signing a loan paper for a new piece of equipment. He was no longer farming 1,000 acres, but the 80 acres he worked felt more like his own than the vast, leveraged empire ever had. One warm summer afternoon, in the late 1980s, Silas was sitting on his porch, watching his grandson, a boy of about 10, try to grease the fittings on the old baler. Ray's son, a boy of the same age, was with him, dutifully wiping the excess grease off the Zerk fittings. Ray came walking across the yard, carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. He handed one to Silas and sat down in the other rocking chair. They watched the boys work, their heads bent together in concentration. "You know," Ray said, breaking the comfortable silence, "my boy asked me the other day why we use this old baler instead of getting one of the new round balers like everyone else has." "What did you tell him?" Silas asked, taking a sip of his tea. "I told him this baler has a story," Ray said, a small smile on his face. "I told him it doesn't have a computer, it doesn't have a payment book, but it has something more important. It has character. And I told him it taught his father a lesson he almost learned too late." Silas nodded, looking out at the fields that stretched before them, green and healthy under the afternoon sun. The land was the same. The sky was the same. The seasons still turned. The only thing that had really changed was the way men thought about them. "What lesson was that?" Silas asked quietly. Ray looked over at his old neighbor, his partner, his friend. "That the goal isn't to own the most land," he said. "It's to not let the land own you." Silas's grandson ran up to the porch, his hands covered in grease. "Grandpa, we're all done. Can we start it up now?" Silas smiled, a deep, genuine smile that reached his eyes. He looked from the boy's eager face to the old, rusty machine standing proudly in the yard, and then out to the horizon. The throaty roar of a new tractor echoed from a farm miles away. But here, in his yard, the only sound was the gentle creak of the porch swing and the whisper of the wind through the corn. "Yes," Silas said, his voice full of a quiet satisfaction that no bank could ever finance and no auctioneer could ever sell. "Let's go hear the old iron sing